year medical student. Really excited to be here. Thanks so much for taking 10 minutes to listen to me. So I want to talk a little bit about this idea of a room of one's own and moving to structural competency. So to start, race for some reason seems to matter in medicine. And what's strange is that race seems to matter more and more in medicine at a time when the rest of our political landscape seems to be more colorblind. So I want to talk a little bit about the politics of colorblindness in medicine and the need to move towards this idea of structural competency, in addition to cultural competency, in order to understand the sources of the health disparities. So to start, in 1993, the National Institute of Health passed the Revitalization Act. And what this required is that all clinical research record data on women and racial minorities. So the issue is that while the Revitalization Act now requires scientific research to include racial categories, very few doctors and scientists have actually confronted the complex racial formation and politics of the US. So this is summed up by Dr. Lisa Hunt, who writes, although race is indeed a prominent category in medical research, education, and practice guidelines, it remains a black box concept. Race is vague and undefined, and clinicians are thus left to their own cultural understandings and assumptions in understanding or in interpreting racial difference. So to understand how we should use race in the clinic, we first have to understand what is race. Is it biologic or is it socially constructed? So race is not a robust biological category. Genetic variation is continuous and overlapping among populations, and yet medical research continues to treat it as discrete, immutable, and genetically homogeneous. Additionally, racial categories are socially constructed. They are transient, dynamic, fluid, and they have changed throughout time. So the US Census, for example, has changed its racial categories every decade since 1870. So what happens when you get twins that look like this? Or these twins? This woman, who is of Middle Eastern descent, is categorized by the US Census as Caucasian. So studies have continued to demonstrate that there is more genetic variation within races than between races. To be clear, ancestral alleles can affect disease rates and pharmaceutical efficacy, but these alleles do not neatly align with commonly used racial groupings. So if we look at these women, so this is important. Reductive race categories do not substitute for ancestral genetic markers, and indeed are poor proxies for such. If we look at these women, we would categorize them all in one patient subset, Hispanic women, and make assumptions about what that means for their clinical care. But these women are from Mexico, Italy, Puerto Rico, Colombia, and Spain. Physician assessments of patient race is continually inaccurate or incomplete. So using race in the clinic without understanding its complicated construction can actually lead to worse patient outcomes. So it's difficult to negotiate the sort of balance between race consciousness and colorblindness. On one hand, race-conscious research is really important because it helps us generate evidence as to the quantitative injustices that continue to happen. At the same time, it requires that biomedical research use race as a variable, which risks reinforcing the biological notions of race that historically supported racial discrimination. Another issue is that framing race as biologic implies that health disparities are due to internal differences. This means that they presumably can be solved by genomic technologies. This diverts attention from the need for social intervention. So this is really important to look at where our resources are going. So from 1994 to 2005, more than 22,000 grants funded research on genetics and race as they related to health. In the same decade, only 44 studies were funded that looked at race and racism as it affects health. This is a 500-to-1 ratio. So race really does have an impact on people and their health. This impact, however, is not written into DNA, but engendered by racist institutions that continue to operate in our country. Every year, more than 100,000 black men, women, and children die because their mortality rates do not equal that of their white counterparts. This is the equivalent to a jumbo jet carrying 260 people crashing every day. So we have to think about why. Moving backwards, we have to recognize how this is tied to the idea of race as a legitimate biological category. The idea of race as intrinsic ominously echoes ideas of the eugenic sphere and diverts culpability from larger structures down to individual people. This creates a very myopic view. It is impossible to understand the landscape of health disparities if we continue to look at specific individuals. We can't whittle down these massive inequities down to people's genomics. Systems, in addition to people, are responsible for continuing to create healthcare disparities. Racism is a massive driver of the concept of health inequity, which is defined by the WHO as the consequence of systemic and unjust distribution of political, socioeconomic, and environmental resources required for the attainment of health. So let's look at this idea. What discrepancies do we see in socioeconomic status, politics, and environment in our country? Politically, 1 in 13 Black Americans are now disenfranchised. This is directly related to the fact that although rates of drug use are similar across races, Black men are 12 times more likely to be arrested on drug offenses. This rate of disenfranchisement in certain parts of our country is creeping past Jim Crow era levels and is a potent mechanism for limiting the ability of Black communities to advocate for their needs and issues. In fact, the US now imprisons a larger percentage of its Black population than South Africa did during apartheid. So how do we understand state violence to be a part of health inequity, especially given the fact that every week a prisoner will die due to inadequate medical care? On a socioeconomic level, healthcare is not free. Especially in this country, access is highly dependent on what you can afford. So while the median household income itself is large, at $60,000 versus $35,000, the median wealth gap is startling at $91,000 for whites, $6,400 for Blacks. Now, if we consider the fact that residence property accounts for almost 50% of the median homeowner's wealth, we have to go back and analyze how Black families were deprived the opportunity for home ownership under discriminatory policies from the New Deal era. So in the 1930s, the Federal Housing Association funded more than 60% of all American homes. Yet less than 2% of these loans went to families of color. Black neighborhoods were routinely redlined and coded for mortgage default, straining Black families in poorly resourced neighborhoods without the means for migration. This is foundational to government-sponsored racialized residential segregation, which is linked to low birth weight, obesity, cardiovascular disease, lower life expectancy, even when controlled for income. So what about the environment? People of color are continuously closer to environmental health hazards. In fact, race, more so than socioeconomic status, is the best predictive variable in determining the placement of a toxic landfill. This is tied to cancer, asthma, miscarriage, neonatal disorders, another whole host of health hazards that again lead to lower life expectancy. So we talk often about healthcare disparities, disparity in outcome, in access, but to get to the root cause, we have to look more at structures. We have to think about health inequity and the consideration that it is racism, not race, that makes us sick. So in medical school, class is scheduled for about 30 hours a week. This includes anatomy, foundational sciences, clinical examination skills. In my first semester as a medical student, 3 hours a month were dedicated to health policy and briefly health disparities. Now in my second semester, this class has been abolished. There's no longer any time in our curriculum allotted to look at the social political context of the science that our medical training is based off of. So we have this propensity to believe that medicine is above and immune to the politics and controversies of this world. But it's not. Medicine does not exist in a vacuum. So to me, this unravels the central point. What we need, the unifying factor for minority health, is that medicine needs to embrace the importance of critical thinking, of questioning the context in which we aim to provide care. So we have to think about segregation, prisons, language, bias, scrutiny, history, and most of all, power. What we need for minority health, for all those with socially marginalized identities, which includes race, but also gender, sexuality, ability, and many others, is a space, a room of one's own to develop these critical thinking skills. The navigation of health and well-being in this country is directly tied to the mechanisms and operation of oppression. Think about what being a minority means. Being a minority means that you will never get to dictate what is considered normal. The nature of this career makes us grapple with really difficult questions. So using race and how we understand race in medicine is one of them, but there are so many others. About ethics, triage, autonomy, end of life, abortion, trans health, mental illness, disability. No one can give us direct answers, and indeed there are none. But at the very least, we have to be able to identify where the questions are and where the controversies lie. The next time you read a study that makes claim on clinical efficacy based on the biology of race, question the facts that are being presented to you. Think about how whittling these giant inequities into individual genomics directly benefits those in power and diverts attention from larger issues. So a few weeks ago at the medical student, I ran into a friend, slumped over his laptop, looking super exhausted. And he told me that for our upcoming exam, he had created 3,500 flashcards. And this is ridiculous to me. This means as first-year medical students, every 3 weeks, we are responsible for memorizing 4,000 new facts. And it's crazy, but I think it speaks to the methodology of medical education as it stands now. It is a whirlwind of rote memorization, a really long exercise in listen, swallow, digest, regurgitate. But medicine, in all of its complication and nuance, cannot be learned like a list of facts. It cannot be transferred like a data entry. To me, I believe medicine that in its entanglement with life and health and normalcy should be considered, pushed against, rolled around the tongue, and then challenged. Our medical curriculum consistently elevates the scientific method as the beginning and end of our training, when medicine does not begin or end with science. Why is it more important for us to examine the chemical mechanisms of asthma medication at a time when our patients walk through the streets chanting, "I can't breathe"? They say that when the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem begins to look like a nail. So to me, I think the most important thing for improving minority health is that we begin to give ourselves more tools. It is racism, not race, that makes us sick. And until we give ourselves more tools and more avenues to find solutions, we will always fall short of the understanding that we need to have to provide the care we want to give. Thank you so much.